Due to Ontario's guidelines, we are presenting these live streaming events in a virtual environment to keep everyone safer. We hope you will join us in the next several weeks. Please stay safe and stay well.
Supply Road live streaming sessions. These sessions we've been doing over the last few months to help people understand what's involved in an environmental assessment, and just explain the project in a little bit more detail. We talk about a lot of different topics, and today I have, as per usual, my co-host, Mr. Michael Fox, who's a project facilitator and director for the Webquay Supply Road project. How are you tonight, Mike?
I'm doing good, thank you.
That's
good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. And next up, we have our special guest, who was our special guest last week, actually, too. But you're still special, Bethany. And Bethany is a social scientist, and she also serves as a consultation specialist and an environmental planner with us. And Bethany is going to have a conversation with Mike and I about the socioeconomic survey, which was going to be undertaken in Webquay in a short time. And the purpose of today's discussion is to go through some of the survey questions and help community members understand why we're asking these questions, maybe explain some of the questions, and just try to make community members a little bit more comfortable, so they don't feel like they've been sort of surprised by this. So we think this will be helpful. We did this last week when it comes to the with regard to the health survey. We thought it worked out fairly well. So why don't we get started? Socioeconomic. So this survey, Bethany, we're trying to get a picture, right? Like a snapshot of the way things are, right?
That's correct, Don. Again, and like the health survey, we're trying to collect that, what we call the baseline, which is the information that's provided around a particular topic as things are now, the conditions as they are now in your community, and in this case, with respect to social and economic conditions.
Now, that's, without having that baseline that you talk about, we just don't have anything to compare to, right? So we have to establish that baseline in order to identify potential effects and effects further down the road, like after the project is built and it's operating, then we can take monitoring information and compare back to it. So the other point that Mike and I discussed in our radio show earlier was that these kinds of surveys are really important. It's really important that community members take these seriously and give us this information to get that snapshot. We want to make sure we truly and accurately capture the way things are for people and economics on the business side as well too. It's really, really important. And then one issue, Bethany, I wanted to sort of ask you about before we dive into the questions is whether this information, how this information is handled. So is it confidential? Do they have to put their name on these things? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
For sure, yeah. As with all the surveys that we're going to be administering, your information, we can't actually see, you won't have to be providing your name or any personal identifying information on these surveys, right? So you will know that the information we collect, we can't link it to you as an individual. And then from that, we also, most of that information that we collect is combined into what we call an aggregate form, which means all those answers that you provide, the numbers are put together into, a single number to represent community responses as a whole, or at least the sample of the number based on the number of people who did respond to the survey. So that's all very, it's very much protected right from the outset. That information is protected just by virtue of the fact that we can't identify you on a survey form.
The other thing I just wanted to mention too, Bethany, and maybe you can expand on this, is that we're trying to encourage as many people as possible to participate in this survey, right? And to make sure that we don't just get men or just elders. And maybe you can explain the importance of that.
For sure. That's a really good point, Don, because what we want is to have not only a lot of people responding to the survey in order to provide greater accuracy and a more comprehensive picture, but also a range of types of people to respond. So the kind of subgroups in the community, which would include, youth and elders and women and men, and all of these different kind of land users as well, like all different types of people need to, well, we hope will respond to the survey. And the reason for that is because we're doing what's called a gender-based analysis plus. So it's now required in the Impact Assessment Act of Canada that we undertake this type of analysis. And it means that we're trying to understand how the project might affect different subgroups differently. So, what we know is that certain development projects can more adversely or more positively sort of impact certain groups disproportionately, meaning that it could affect women more than men in particular ways. So it could be that women are affected, could be more vulnerable to the fact that there's a construction project that's near the community where there's, there could be more gender-based kind of violence associated with that or harassment. And we know that from other resource development projects, other just development projects themselves, like a road. We know that from other projects that these things can happen. So we want to make sure that we understand what those kind of social and economic conditions are like for different groups, to know how they might benefit more from the project or potentially be adversely impacted by the project, and thereby we need to, or therefore I should say that we need to introduce management measures or things that we could do to make sure that doesn't happen or isn't as severe as it could be.
That's a very good answer. I mean, all these different sort of views or perspectives, because the views that women may have or youth may have could be very different from those of elders, right? Or middle-aged men, sure. Couldn't they, right? So you want to capture that as to the greatest extent you can, right?
Yes, it's also about capturing different views and perspectives, not just the conditions. So I've been speaking mostly to things like where women might have lower incomes or men might be more unemployed. So we look at, how they could be differently affected by a project. But it's also that people's lived experiences based on things like gender and race and class all affect their perspectives on the project as well, and their aspirations for the project.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get confused too why the phrase socioeconomics or why is socioeconomics part of an environmental assessment? Because people think of environmental assessment as just that, the environment. Suddenly we're doing a socioeconomics. Maybe explain or highlight why socioeconomics is part of the EA process.
Oh, that's a really good point, Mike. And it's something that, if you're an EA practitioner, as we call it, then you kind of, get used to that terminology. But I think it should be explained because, yeah, you're right. It's traditionally been called, and it still is in Ontario, environmental assessment, where it's actually the new federal act is called it impact assessment, because that more accurately reflects what we're doing, which is trying to understand all different types of ways and that projects can affect people. That includes the human environment component. And by that, we mean, like, people are intimately connected with the environment. Of course, we know that, especially Indigenous peoples and their relations to the environment, but also our social conditions and economic conditions are part of what can be impacted by a road. Our incomes can go up because we have, you have jobs now. Your incomes, so there's that factor. It could be that there's easier access to an educational facility in a larger center. It could be that there's actually more outsiders coming into the community, which puts pressure on particular services. It could also mean that there's more opportunities for Indigenous businesses through these kinds of social impacts and economic impacts. So, yeah, it's a very narrow way I think, to describe it as just an environmental assessment, which luckily at the federal level now it's reflected more broadly. And certainly there's the cultural aspects as well, that we aren't focusing as much with the socioeconomic study, but it will come into play, and it will come into play more with the traditional or the Indigenous knowledge and land use studies.
Let's take a look at the first section of the survey. It's called Respondent Demographics. Maybe you can help us a bit and define demographics for us a bit, Bethany, just to sort of help us sort of understand this section a little bit better.
Sure. I mean, probably, people listening out there would know what they are without actually calling them demographics. Kind of a fancy word for things like age and gender, education levels, income levels. So those are all very like information that's collected through the census, for example. It's kind of the very basic foundational kind of questions that are meant to help us understand, what people's how, first of all, if we're talking about age and gender, how people might answer the survey differently based on those factors, right? So we really, as I mentioned, we need to understand how people are differently affected and how they might view things differently based on age or gender, as examples, but also the fact that, of course, things like income and education and employment are all very central to our social and economic kind of, I guess you could say, basis, for understanding our social and economic condition in life. So those are what we refer to as demographic questions.
So they're sort of the foundation, really, of the survey. Those are the sort of the foundational questions, right? The core questions.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And they help you break down the data, I guess, too, for the responses to the other questions as well. So, one question I thought I'd ask you, Bethany, is related to the questions about income. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess the question is, why are these questions being asked about income? Excuse me.
Yeah, for sure. Because we think that there could be for example, there could be impacts, potential impacts from the construction of the road and the operation of the road that would impact people's incomes based on. And there might be jobs in construction. There might be, those are kind of direct impacts. There might be other impacts like opportunities for Indigenous businesses, to provide catering or some other kind of support service or support business to the construction and operation of the road. So we try to understand, like, if if you have a certain income now, we think about, okay, could this go up or down based on the effects of the road? And then we try to monitor it later to see, so we could, re-administer the survey in a few years and say, oh, have incomes in, for example, in Wawatay actually gone up or not, or have they gone down, or have they stayed the same? And that could be because of, we could, if we see that kind of a trend, might be able to at least say it's plausible that this is attributable to the project, and any potential future developments linked to the road, such as mining development.
Mike, you and I were actually talking about during the radio show, right, how some of these project impacts can be negative too, right? When all of a sudden community members are making a lot more money than they were before, right? And the need for community members to be prepared, in some way, all of a sudden their income's gone up substantially, but they don't have that sort of preparation and that knowledge yet as to how to manage money, basic things like personal finance, right, Mike?
Yeah, I was sharing an example. There's a community that got involved in the forestry, and they became part of the forestry mill. And so there was job opportunities that was offered to the community members. And so most of the members were on social assistance. This is like the late 80s. And I think there was $300 a month that they were used to living off. And they went from $300 to $3,000 a month. And so you have sort of these derivative impacts, so that there was a positive impact in terms of increased incomes, but there's these the follow through of that, learning how to manage personal wealth, I guess you can call it. Just like anybody else, if we win a lottery, and all of a sudden you win $10 million, not everybody has $10 million, and how do you manage $10 million? You gotta find some help. So that things aren't taxed, or things, you need all this expertise to manage newfound wealth like that, right? Well, the same thing is, it's more on personal wealth. You have a job, it's like the rest of us, I guess. If you get a job for 20 years at $50,000 a year, that's $1 million in 20 years of your adult life you make. And what you do with that $1 million over the 20 years, $50,000 a year is something you have to learn. And some people learn the long way when you realize they spent most of it, and not realizing that there wasn't a whole lot of wealth management, personal wealth management. So it's stuff like that, that some of us grew up with, some of us haven't.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a very good point. Why don't we move on to housing now, section 1.2. There's some interesting questions here. Housing, as you and I talked about earlier today, Mike, housing is a really, obviously it's very, very important, but this is a particular importance in the remote communities because of the significant and severe lack of housing and the cost of building new houses and the difficulty in moving construction materials on winter roads if they don't have all-season roads leading to the community. So this is a very interesting sort of section here, and it's really important. I think it's really important as part of the baseline to capture as much information as we can, I think, about housing. Would you say so, Bethany? I mean, we're looking at, there's quite a few questions here. We're looking at how many people live in a house, how many rooms there are, things like that.
Yeah, exactly, Don. For sure. Housing is a huge issue, I know, for many Indigenous peoples in the north and the far north, and as you say, here with remote communities. So we need to understand, are there crowded conditions already? Are they there already? And try to get a more, even if we just know there are, we need to know, how many, our houses are overcrowded with too many people for the square footage or for the number of bedrooms. things like the condition of the homes as well. What kind of condition are they in? And so trying to understand if major repairs are needed, and also, are they affordable? Like how affordable are the homes? Are they being rented? Are they owned? And that way we know, because there could be potential impacts with the road and potential future development projects beyond that. That may mean that there's increased pressures on housing in the community. So if more people want to move back for jobs with the road or in mining, or if there's more people coming from different cities that find that this is somewhere they want to live because there's this access, live again because there's this all-season access road, then we need to try and account for that as a potential impact, and know, okay, how stretched is the housing situation already, and then what's actually needed based on the potential for population growth.
I mean, many community members can't live in their community even though they would like to, because there is no place for them to live, right? I mean, we know that firsthand. One other interesting question here is asking about how much home energy and heating costs per month are. And this, Mike and I had a discussion earlier about this, and these can be substantial, right? Because these homes are powered by diesel generators, and baseboard electric heating is very, very expensive, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, and not only just those conditions alone, but in a cold climate context, even more so, right? Like, and you're right, those gen sets, they're some are subsidized in some communities through the Ontario Energy Board, operated by Hydro One remotes, and then you have some communities that are independent power authorities, and the operative word there is independent, where they don't get operating subsidies per se, so the costs there are actually more, and there's different types of heating costs. Some are still wood stove, some are still oil. So we're trying to get a picture of that through the survey, so that we have some sense of the operating costs of these homes, whether by power or heat.
And we talked briefly about this before, but finding out how many people live in the home, right, and how many bedrooms there are, understanding sort of the density of living, because of course, as Mike, you and I talked about earlier, many of these homes were built to standards from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, so they're not built to, many of them, the older homes weren't built to any building codes. And as a result, they require a lot of repair. Perhaps mold forms more easily, they're fire hazards. There's just so many other aspects. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I believe every few years, I think it's an ISC does inspections, home inspections in communities, detailed home inspections.
I don't know about that, Don, but we'll find out. I do know that in the past, the first sort of wave of housing stocks that was being built, there wasn't really an enforceable housing code. The contractors would come in, they'd give it a set, they had to build 10 homes, whatever, but they would take shortcuts or trim costs here or function of time. So they weren't built to code. And a lot of those initial wave of housing stocks are in disrepair. What typically would last maybe 40, 50 years, lasts probably 20 years and therefore require major renovations. And so I know some communities they have in their housing stock, they know which one are in disrepair, they know which should be condemned, and then they're trying to build new ones on that. So part of this study is trying to get a picture of that, for the Indigenous communities, because it's going to be different both remotes, semi-remotes, and rural communities.
Yeah, and I should say too, just sorry, because we were talking about the health study and the health survey before, which there's another health survey in addition to the one we talked about last week, but housing conditions is certainly something that feeds into the health impact assessment as well for this project, and it's very important because overcrowding causes a lot of stress. It tends to cause very stressful conditions, and can lead to an increase in things like domestic violence or other kind of behaviors and that aren't healthy for families. And then there's also things like, of course, like mold isn't good for our respiratory systems, and other like things if there's not enough insulation and you're quite cold, that's poor. That's not a good thing for our health if you're very cold all the time, or not getting enough warmth. And then so things like that, or there's safety issues for children in the house where they could be accidents, and all of that as well is important for feeding into the health component.
Oh, that's a very good point. Thank you for tying that back to health. That's important. Let's move on now to education. This is an interesting topic, I think, and it's important. It's really important that we get that baseline established on education. Can you talk a bit, Bethany, about the education component of the survey?
Demographic kind of indicator we want to track, or way of institutions. So we want to try to understand what those levels are, because that is something that there's a potential impact or route to call it like a pathway to the project, to the road. That kind of interaction where the educational opportunities might increase. There's greater access to those opportunities with the road, for example. So those are, and also because things like education levels tie to the kind of employment opportunities we get. So everything kind of connects with these things, and education is also linked, we know, to health, to better, like higher education levels, to better health outcomes. So all of these things are connect, and we want to make those connections through the project and these surveys.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay, let's move on to employment, section 1.4. This is an interesting topic, right? Trying to get that sort of snapshot of the employment situation. So we're looking for information like employment status, employed, unemployed, looking for work, retired, semi-retired, self-employed. This is an important section, isn't it, for establishing that baseline too, and then whether community members are receiving benefits, right? Government benefits as well too.
Yeah. So again, understanding what their employment situation is, to understand if the project might impact them, positively in that regard, and also what their skills are or their kind of education is, to know if there's sort of a pool of potential community members who have the skills that would be needed for things like road construction and operation, and potentially the mining development down the road as well. So those are the things that we're trying to understand with this, with those questions.
Yeah, Mike and I talked about this a little bit earlier too. It takes a sort of a preliminary snapshot of the capacity of the community in terms of education and skills, and And I mentioned that as the project sort of matures and gets closer to reality, the efforts that will be made to find out more about community members, their education, their skill sets, but also what their motivations are, right? And their interests are.
Exactly.
Trying to drill down and get that information as early as possible so that they can start doing some matchmaking and identifying maybe there's a training program that's suitable. This person's very interested in, operating heavy equipment. They like working outside. They like working with their hands. Well, then, maybe the trade route is a way to go, right? So the earlier that information is sort of collected, and the earlier that kind of matchmaking can be done, and community members can get set up in training programs, right? To get the certifications that they need.
That's right. That's a great way to say it, Don. I think I couldn't have said that better. That's exactly what we're trying to do with these questions. And like you said too, like it's not just whether you have the skills or the education, but do you want them? Do you want to? What are your interests? Do you want to work in something like more like environmental monitoring, perhaps, and that kind of area, or do you want to work in the construction industry and the trades and operating heavy equipment at all? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but those are just things we're trying to understand. And especially, this is actually very important with respect to GBA plus and understanding what kind of skills that women have and in the communities, and what kind of employment situation they're in or their status, because women are often very much, they're not employed as much in things like construction, road construction, for example, or just construction in general, or mining. If there's only 14% of women employed in mining in Canada, I think I just saw that figure the other day. So, understanding how we can, how these projects could potentially benefit women more if they need particular types of training, or want a particular type of job in the mining industry, and how that could be matched, as you say, later with particular programs or employment options.
I was going to ask you a bit, Bethany, about the mining related questions in this section.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about, what the reasoning is behind those kinds of questions?
Yeah, the reason behind those is because there's some very specific skills and potential opportunities in mining with the road potentially connecting to the Ring of Fire mineral development. And so, trying to understand, again, what are the specific types of mining employment kind of skills and positions there might be already in the community, and where there might be a gap, where some might be needed to build on those, because there is a lot of different types of, or range of kind of skills needed, I think, in mining. And again, for women, it's also they tend to be kind of underemployed in those in the mining sector. So trying to get a snapshot of that now, kind of understanding that capacity, as you say, now helps us to, again, maybe match it up, create this kind of pool of potential candidates, and then match them up later.
Another question I had here was, I look at question 35. If you experience barriers to getting or maintaining employment, please identify what they are. That's really interesting, because there are a lot of barriers, aren't there?
Yeah, this is a really important question for, again, addressing the GBA plus, the gender-based analysis plus, because, yeah, if you look at things like construction or mining, there's a lot of shift work that might be required, or it could be, periods where you're just 12 hours away and 12 hours back at home, or 12 hours for a few days and then back for 3 days or something. So it's not like a 9 to 5 job. It could be, but it isn't necessarily. And so if you have children to take care of, if you're a single mom, if you have elders that you're trying to look after and take care of, If you have other schooling going on, if you have other types of land use activities and hunting and fishing that you're doing that could be interrupted by the schedules of construction and mining, we need to know that so that we can think about, okay, what would be the kind of, again, needs that need to be met, the management kind of options we could provide for increased childcare or more flexibility with schedules for especially single moms, or if there's periods where those who need and want to hunt and fish in those seasons and those times, that they can be provided with that flexibility.
Let's talk a bit about social services. Mike, these are fundamental services, but they don't all exist, do they, in every community to the extent probably that they need to, do they?
No, they're pretty recent for most remote First Nations. Things that are sort of taken for granted in the mainstream, like childcare, or even subsidized childcare. Right? There's childcare, and then there's subsidized childcare for low-income families, and so just pick any society, Alzheimer's society. If you have a senior citizen or elder that requires extra support, or the family taking care of that person that needs extra support, that's not necessarily available in a lot of these remote communities. So, trying to again get a snapshot of what kind of support services are there in the communities, and watch it change. I think one of the key things too is the demand for it, right? So we can take a baseline picture now, but there will be indicators that'll be monitored, from a positive, like raise in income and raise the number of jobs, but also the negative ones. So maybe, I don't know, more alcohol abuse, maybe, or maybe more crime, because of alcohol, because a lot of times. But we'll trace those based on the baseline, and watch as that human environment changes based on the project. And I'll give you an example. Like in Thunder Bay, when I first went to Thunder Bay in 1988, there was 800 housing starts, right? And the economy there was driven by the grain mill operations, shipping, wheat out to Europe from the prairie basket, or the wheat basket of Canada, the prairies. Then the forestry was 30% of the economy. Barbargie probably was operating at max at 1,800 to 2,000 employees. So you had a lot of people working in those work environments. So it's a different set of skills, right? To work in Barbargie, to work in the forestry and the woodland operations, to work at the grain mill operations or the railways, etc., to what it is today. Fast forward today, the biggest employers are public institutions. Lakehead University with 2,000 plus employees, the City Hall with 2,000 plus employees, regional hospitals 2,000 employees, the Board of Education over 2,000. So the jobs, these are the biggest employers are now in Thunder Bay. So over a period of time, the nature of the economy and what supports that economy has changed. So that's the purpose of this too. There's a lot of public, right now the majority of especially the remotes, are probably the biggest employers are probably the public institutions, the band office, the education, the nursing stations, etc. And we'll watch that change over time if this project goes forward, because it may get to more of the private sector or band-owned enterprises. So that's one of the purposes of this of the survey.
And you know, it's interesting, Bethany, because we've listed a number of different social services, and then people are to check off whether they have no access, have access but don't use, and then frequency of access, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that should provide a pretty good picture of the way things are, right?
Yeah, we hope so.
Question. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of options for sure there, and for different types of social services that may or may not exist. And then, yeah, how often do you use them? So again, getting at what are the kind of needs there? Are they already at a high frequency of use? So could any extra pressure from an increased, population or even outsiders coming in potentially, then how does that put them over this kind of threshold or tipping point of being unable to be able to provide to the community? So we need to know that now and try to predict what's needed again in terms of any increase in certain types of service.
There's another section here that I'm kind of interested in asking you about because I think maybe we need to explain it a little bit for community members. And it's the section called social cohesion and culture. And this might be a little tricky it was tricky for me, I'll be honest, to sort of understand exactly how would you rate the number of social connections you have in WFN? How would you rate the quality of the social connection? So what are you sort of getting at with those questions, Bethany? I mean, I kind of get it, but maybe you can help me with this.
Yeah, it's actually, it's not always an obvious thing, especially using a term like social cohesion. I would be, more about the social, connections that we have. And that's in there because we do know from changes, to the as Mike was mentioning, these potentially significant changes to the economies, the regional and the local economy, and with resource development projects, that there can be changes to the sort of social fabric of a community in terms of the kind of there can be sort of disruptions to that kind of social fabric in the way that people relate, maybe their support they have or don't have for a project, who's getting jobs or who isn't. If there's an increase in exposure to drugs and alcohol, for example, then that can cause more stress in the community and more problems problems in terms of the social kind of relationships and networks that people have. So that's what we're trying to understand now is what are the social connections like now, and could they be disrupted with the project or not? Or maybe people will become, closer too. We don't know. But the quality and the quantity is basically, there's different ways that social connections can be measured. And it's something that's, we could talk about the extent to which you volunteer in the community or the number of events you go to, social events. If how many connections you have is important, but also is the quality of the connections. Because I know I'm someone who tends to be a bit more of an introvert, so I tend to have like fewer friends probably, but the friends that I do have, I try to have a really good connection with those people. So, so we try to take both of those kind of measures to understand that social cohesion. Did you want me to speak to culture as well there? Or
well, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to follow up with you on that. I think of community events, and I know Wawatay has a lot of community events. They get a lot of participation in those events. So that's kind of an example, really, right? Or
for sure.
That's part of what we mean by social cohesion, right? Because, Wawatay has all kinds of fishing derbies. Fishing derbies. They've had stand-up comedy, they've had I think concerts, right, as well as the more traditional ones, powwows, cookouts, things like that, right? So I just wanted to know, that's kind of an example, right?
For sure, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. It's like you can measure it in a lot of, there's many ways to measure it, I guess,
Yep.
but that would be certainly one good one important one. And we have a question speaking to those kind of social events or cultural events. Yeah.
Okay. What was I going to ask you next? So many questions here. Okay, let's talk a bit about safety. And I don't think this one's as obvious initially, right? But I think it's an important one, obviously, right? So tell us a bit about this safety section and the questions you're asking related to safety.
Yeah. So the safety component of the survey is trying to understand both, how, well, part of it is understanding if people feel safe or if they don't, but also what kind of safety issues they have concerns about, and if that is related to kind of gender-based issues. It could be gender-based violence. It could be violence against children. They're very sensitive kind of issues as well. We understand that. And trying to understand if there's, what kind of safety issues there are. Is it in relation to crime as well, if that's an issue, and so if how people really kind of feel about that in their community, and then understanding if that would change through the road and the potential road and the mineral development. Again, because what we know is that there can be an increase in rates of crime, as Mike mentioned, with tied to development projects. And the potential for increase in sexual harassment of women, domestic violence even, and again, that gender-based violence increases in as well. Traffic safety is another component of that, because we're talking about a road that goes right into the community. So obviously that's going to be an issue. Is there going to be, what kind of safety concerns are there around speed limits or speed in general? Having stop signs, being too close to homes, the road, and what can we then do to try and again mitigate those potential effects? So what could we do? Could we put in more certain stop signs at certain spots? Could we put fencing next to homes? Could we put up, speed limits? What should those speed limits be? So things like that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Bethany, that's interesting, because I know Mike and I have, he may remember this. We visited a community, northwestern Ontario, and we were talking about this project, and they had gone through the experience a number of years ago of being connected to the provincial highway, and one of the things that they said to us was, road safety is something to take very seriously, and the need for sidewalks, right? A separate right of way for pedestrians. Exactly. Because they obviously had some negative experiences from that, right? Do you remember that, Mike?
Yeah, I do.
Specifically mentioned.
Yeah, I remember, policing too, right? The extra requirements for policing when you have a road. So like enforcing, in this case it would be the Highway Traffic Act, around the road safety. So adopting sort of a set of regulations that's going to help people feel safer. Like you're not having drag races, or people are, doing 120 kilometers an hour through a community type of thing. So it was an important discussion to learn from other Indigenous communities' experience connecting to the provincial highway system.
Yeah, when you mentioned connecting to the provincial highway system, that reminds me of a discussion we had earlier today where we were talking a bit about, implications of being connected to the provincial highway system, right? And there may be a need for vehicles to be, to be insured, right? Mm-hmm. If those vehicles and registered with the province, right? And all those other things which aren't cheap. Mm-hmm. We had that discussion, didn't we, Mike?
Yeah, right now, I believe the Highway Traffic Act. It's up to the chief and council to decide whether to apply that on reserve for Ontario's reserve, anyways. And some have. I think of one community has a forestry road that goes through the reserves, and so they elected to have the Highway Traffic Act be enforced by Anishinaabe Police Services on reserve. So none of the truckers, forestry trucks, can go by, not observing the rules of the day. Where there's other communities I know choose not to elect. So you have a lot of unregistered cars, uninsured vehicles, and unlicensed drivers because there's no enforcement. So that's probably the likelihood up north. As part of the conditions, the current conditions, that there are probably unlicensed vehicles. There's probably a number of uninsured vehicles and unlicensed drivers because the Highway Traffic Act is not being applied to on reserve. But once you connect it off reserve, something's going to have to regulate that road once it leaves the reserve. And so part of the implication is the enforcement of the rules of the road, and that's probably the Anishinaabe Police Services.
Yeah, these are big changes, aren't they, Mike? Right? I mean, this is quite an adjustment for community members to get used to, right? But I mean, if having that sort of fixed link all season, there are strings attached to that, right? There are things that have to be followed. Such as insurance and registration and licensing, right? And all these things have to be considered. I mean, you and I have on another project had conversations with Anishinaabe Police Service, didn't we, about these issues? And it was it's pretty interesting, right? Learning those different experiences where some communities adopted, right, Highway Traffic Act and others didn't.
Yeah, and it's about risk too, like in community safety, and so that dialogue is happening and probably will happen, and decisions will be made, as the possible eventuality of a road, where people can drive away. They're already doing it now. I know in Mubakwe they're actually setting up remote driver license training and testing. I think one time we were visiting there, and there was that was actually happening, and they were actually getting tested too as they drove around the community, the new drivers. So that's part of the anticipated changes that people will need their license, or it's good to have a license, where none was required before, right?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting topic and something you don't immediately think about. But well, we've made it through the entire survey, if you can believe it. Wow, that's I can't believe we did that. Maybe Bethany, you could talk a bit about, before we go, about the next steps with the survey.
Yeah, sure. Well, we do want to actually administer it. But yeah, we go through, we're trying to, I guess, refine some of that now, where we are, trying to look at options for administering, for example, either door to door or online, and trying to provide different options, or it could be at a community meeting. Again, a lot of this depends on the COVID restrictions in place, and having enough resources to administer a survey. So we haven't finalized that, I don't think yet, but it could involve training some community members to administer a survey door to door, which tends to result in a higher response rate. There will also be an online option. But again, we understand that not everyone has access to internet, right? So wouldn't be possible for everyone to answer that way necessarily. And so we're just looking at, how we can sort of have the highest response rate. What is the best way to get, the highest response rate? And often that's a face-to-face kind of interview process where people can be guided through the questions a bit more, and we can help them answer them more accurately, at least so to make sure that they understand what we're asking, right? So yeah.
Thank you for that. Any final thoughts, Mike?
No, no. So typically, I announce next week's sessions, but we're going to take a 1 week to plan the next series of live streaming, and stay tuned. Follow us on our hashtag link WFN at Supply Road. Again, WFN at Supply Road, and get updated through there. Appreciate
and
your time,
website
Bethany.
too.
Yes, the website as well.
Yes. Bethany, thanks again for joining us today. Lots of information from you, and we really appreciate it. I hope this has helped community members better understand why we're doing these, why we're asking these questions, and we really encourage you to participate in it as much as possible, because it's really important to the environmental assessment. So on behalf of Bethany and Mike, just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will talk to you in a couple of weeks. Topic to be announced. So thanks again, and don't forget to visit our website, supplyroad.ca, and we'll talk to you very soon. Take care.